Welcome everyone to another edition of Wetland Wednesday. So before we get started, I'd just like to say that I'm coming at you today from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, and it encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. If you're tuning in for the first time this evening and you haven't seen any of the recorded webinars, my name is Leanne Lachermoy, and I work for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a national nonprofit organization with a mission to conserve wild birds and their habitats across Canada. So we like to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And hopefully, this webinar and this series covers all of those, where we, help you with your understanding and your appreciation, and maybe inspire you to, help conserve wetlands as they are around you. So wetlands have a soft spot in my heart, and we're going to be introduced to a species today that for me started it all. So I'm excited for tonight's webinar. On the agenda, we're going to do some birds and frogs, and that's going to be recorded and posted on the YouTube channel. And then afterwards, we're going to be talking about a couple of guided marsh walks. We've got one coming up in Regina, and I know I've been promising to come to Brandon, but we're going to go to Minnedosa instead. I think it's going to be a better spot to view some wetlands. So we've got a greater, diversity of habitats in the spot we're thinking of in Minnedosa. So we'll be in Minnedosa Sunday, June 25th. And then afterwards, we'll have some questions and discussion, as well as some quizzes. Oh, without further ado, let's get cracking on our species for this evening. So we've got the Gadwall, the American Wigeon, two lovely duck species. Got a couple of heron-like birds. We've got the great blue heron, the American bittern, and the least bittern. We also have the Wilson's Phalarope, which is an interesting species. And we're going to be covering off two species of toad, the Canadian and the American toad. So let's get started with that Gadwall. Gadwall on the prairies is a really, really common duck. You're going to be seeing them in, most wetlands that have open water. It's a relatively large dabbling duck. It's going to be a little bit smaller than the mallard, but still on the big size. Got a steeper forehead and a slender, smaller bill. This is going to come in handy when we're trying to compare females. The drake is, when you see it up close, there's all this, lines and speckling, but overall, especially at a distance, the appearance is just really of a gray kind of plain bird. And what really stands out on this species is the black rear end. Now it's a large dark patch both above and below the tail, and kind of counter to the white. You know how the white really stands out if you're looking at a bird in the distance. This black also kind of stands out as being just a large dark patch on this otherwise kind of pale grayish looking bird. So if you see this all black rear end, you've got a Gadwall drake. The bill is relatively slender compared to a few other ducks, and it's got kind of a dark hue with variable amounts of orange along the sides. And some of the drakes will have some orange, and some of them will have an all dark bill. But either way, it's kind of a bit more of a slender bill than, say, something like a mallard or especially a northern shoveler. So again, you can see that more distant kind of hazy photo at the bottom center here of that kind of grayish duck with a just large black rear end. The drake is going to have a cinnamon patch on the upper wing, which you can sometimes see when the bird is loafing, and you'll be able to see it in flight, and a black and white speculum. The hen, on the other hand, she's going to be a little bit tougher to tell apart from, say, the fairly similar sized and looking mallard, but we'll compare the two shortly here. So here's where your shape is going to start to come in handy, that steeper forehead. Once you get to know your ducks a little better, you'll start to pay more attention to the shapes of their heads. And she's got a steeper forehead. Maybe this is like, if you ski at all, maybe this is a blue run, or, not quite edging into the black diamonds yet, but, this is a little bit harder than an easy ski out. So she's mottled brown overall, and she's got an orange edge on her fine dark bill. And she's also got a bit of a faint eye line, and that white speculum patch can be frequently visible while she's floating around. Not always, but if you do see that broad white patch, that can be a handy, field mark for it. And, when you're first learning your ducks, I know I've said this a few times, don't stress out about the hens too much. Really focus on the drakes, get those males down. They're more brightly colored, they've got more distinct plumage. And by association, especially, the first part of the season, they're often going to be swimming around with females. So you can start to learn them a bit by association, get used to those shapes of those ducks, and then you can start to focus in on the hens because they're tricky. And sometimes you can't tell what it is, especially if it's way off in the distance. There's no knowing for sure sometimes. So that hen is going to have that black and white speculum patch as well. What do they eat? These guys are actually mostly vegetarian, so they'll eat lots of submerged aquatic vegetation, seeds, and during the egg laying period, the hen is really going to go hard a little bit more on the aquatic invertebrates, so insects and crustaceans. And, this is when she's, getting ready to lay all of those eggs, so she really needs the extra protein in her diet. But otherwise, a fairly vegetarian duck. And they make one of my favorite duck noises, and a sound that I think is fairly distinctive. And conveniently, this is a chatty duck. They're going to be making this noise a fair bit. So this is the drake's call. And it goes bep, 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 bep. But it also, if you've ever watched Sesame Street yourself or had kids that watched it, these aliens make noises that sound a lot like the Gadwall. So here, let's listen to it. So they'll do this as they're floating around on a pond. They will do it as they're flying around. They're quite chatty with this little bep 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 call. I love it. It makes me smile every time I hear it. And those of you that joined me on the walk in Saskatoon can attest to it. I do love this sound. So that is the Gadwall, that kind of bep 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 noise, and that just dark black rear end on this otherwise gray duck. This is another one with a broad distribution across those mid-northern latitudes. Let's focus in on, the North American context. So for whatever reason, they kind of stops at southern Ontario, but very much a duck of the Central Plains. You'll see them really frequently here on the Great Plains. Really, anything that has a little bit of open water, you're likely to have a Gadwall in it, and usually in a fair amount of numbers. We saw a few ourselves this weekend as we were out birding in Saskatoon. Let's compare a couple of those hens. So I brought up the mallard, who you're going to go, oh my goodness, this looks fairly similar. Go, you're right, they are fairly similar, but there is a few tricks to tell the two apart. So pay attention to the bill size. The mallard's going to have a slightly larger bill than the Gadwall. The Gadwall is just going to look a little bit, sleeker and smaller. On the mallard, the hen usually has an orange bill with kind of a dark splotchy center. These can be spotted or it can be quite a dark saddle. But otherwise, there's more orange to the bill than on the Gadwall hen. The Gadwall hen is going to have a dark bill with kind of orange just along the sides. It's not going to be on the top of the bill at all. And the speculum in the mallard, you can often see that in the hens as they're floating around. So the speculum is going to be blue, bordered with white and black in our mallards, both above and below. And you're going to mostly just see that white patch on the Gadwall as she's floating around. Comparing now to the northern shoveler, that bill on the northern shoveler is just really large. It's broad. It looks like a great big spatula. It's orange with these olivey tinges to it. But really, when you look at these ducks side by side, the bill size is quite remarkably different. Again, that Gadwall, finer, dark with a bit of orange along the side. You don't see the speculum so much on the northern shoveler hens, especially as they're floating around, but if you did, it would be green bordered with white above. And again, that speculum patch that you usually see on the Gadwall is going to be white on the hens. We also did cover the northern pintail. She's going to have a nice, sleek, long neck, elegant profile, and a dark bill. And the two teals that we covered as well, the green-winged teal and the blue-winged teal, are going to be much smaller ducks, and they're both going to have dark bills as well. So these are the ones you might confuse with slightly orangey bills and mottled coloration. Okay, so those are the Gadwall compared to other species. Now we've got one other duck today, the American Wigeon. This isn't the most common duck species. In fact, it's one that you don't see quite as often. We were lucky enough to see a pair in Saskatoon this weekend. It's a medium-sized dabbling duck, so it's going to be smaller looking than our mallards and our Gadwall. The drake is quite elegantly plumaged, I think. He's got a small blue-gray bill that's edged all around in black. It's sometimes darker in the hen, so it can look a fair bit more gray and very similar to the rest of the black. The drake has this really lovely white or kind of buffy, pale beige colored cap and forehead, and it's got a broad iridescent green stripe behind the eye, kind of like really dramatic eyeshadow, like stage makeup that someone might put on for a play. However, the extent of that is quite variable, and we did see one this weekend that really didn't have hardly any of that green, and I didn't realize quite how variable this species was until I was putting this presentation together. So there is an illustration here by John Schmidt that's showing just the differences in the facial plumage. Some of these ducks have less dark on the face, and the whole face just looks a fair bit more pale colored and white. We'll see an example of that here, but up in the top left corner, you can see one of those males that has just a really reduced amount of both the white and that eyeshadow, that, you know, great big patch of green, but you can still see that eyeshadow, and that bill is still colored, that blue-gray edged in black. Along the side of the body, they're going to have this nice kind of pinkish brown color, and their rear end is going to be, you know, split down the middle, black and white. The speculum is green with a great big white patch on top in the drake. Taking a look at our hen, she actually retains some of that eyeshadow look to her, which makes her pretty distinctive in terms of the dabbling ducks. So she's got that small blue-gray bill edged in black, which I said, you know, just pay attention to, can be a little bit darker. She's got a steep forehead as well, and that dark eyeshadow, that dark smudge around the eye. Her grayish head is going to contrast with just slightly warmer brown tones. They're not quite as pink as in the drake, but it's still definitely reminiscent of that coloration on the drake. So warmer brown on the body. And her speculum is going to be green with a little bit of a white patch on the upper wing. It's going to be fairly reduced in the females. On the left-hand side here, that drake, you can see this one here has a fair amount of white on his face. So it's just kind of a neat variation, you know, within individuals in that species, but still really retaining that crown and that eyeshadow appearance. These guys are also mostly vegetarian. They'll eat aquatic vegetation, upland grasses, including clover, fruits, seeds. They'll eat agricultural seeds and leaves. And again, the hen during the egg-laying period is going to, you know, feast a fair bit more on aquatic invertebrates, so those insects and crustaceans as well. The habitat you'll find these guys in is shallow wetlands with open water, and they really like areas with a bit more upland cover, so some native grasses and stuff for them to nest in, because they do nest a fair ways away from the water. You can see this individual, the drake on the bottom here, he's got more of a, you know, a buffy, a tan striped white patch on his forehead instead of that bright white. So it's just a, you know, an interesting variation. I'll play their call, but it won't be a call that we'll focus on very much. They don't do it quite as often as other duck species, and it gets lost in the chatter if it's a busy morning, but they do kind of like a zoo, 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 zoo call. So that's our American Wigeon, kind of a distinct species, and even the hen is kind of distinctive with that eyeshadowy patch. And as the name suggests, this one is American in its distribution, so we don't have that global distribution of this species. There is a Eurasian widgeon that is sometimes a vagrant in North America, but we have our own American widgeon. And this is a duck species that's definitely, kind of western and northern in its distribution, but you might get lucky and see some on migration back east. Okay, moving on from the ducks, we're going to get into a couple of heron species. So first off, we've got the great blue heron, and that's a pretty descriptive name for this species. It is quite large, and it is overall quite blue. So it's going to have this great honkin' big dagger-like bill. It's going to be large and yellow and black. It's really an all-purpose bill for eating, as we'll see later, all kinds of food items. It's got a very long, slender neck with long legs, and you'll often see it, wading fairly deep in water, so you can't always tell just how long those legs are. Both sexes are going to look very similar. They're going to be kind of this blue-gray overall, and they'll have this bold black stripe kind of that goes, up behind the eye, a little bit more of an eyebrow thing going, and a little bit down the head. In the adult, the crown is white, and in the juveniles or immature birds, it's going to be more of a black gray tone. So you can see the individual on the upper left here has got this white cap. It's an adult, and the one on the top left is going to be a younger bird because it's got that darker cap overall. We'll have a little bit of striping down the center of the neck. The center of the neck will be white with a little bit of stripes on it, and those stripes will go down to the belly. And they actually grow these really, fantastic ornamental plumes on the head, the back, and the breast during the breeding season. You can see the one in the upper left-hand corner is going to have some of those long plumes coming off of its back and coming off of its neck. And that neck is really, highly mobile, and depending on the bird's posture, they can have it totally tucked in, like in the bottom right-hand picture here, or it can be, totally extended. One thing that they do is when they're flying, and once they've taken off, they will retract their neck into kind of an S shape. So when they're flying, they don't fly with their neck straight out. If you've ever seen a sandhill crane, which is going to be another kind of large blue-gray bird, the sandhill crane flies with its neck out, completely out. So it's going to be a long-necked bird in flight, whereas the great blue heron is going to retract its neck into that S position as it's flying. So if you ever, maybe thinking, gosh, I don't know what that, dark gray blue bird is it a sandhill crane or a great blue heron? Just check to see how they're holding the neck in flight. And they'll keep their legs out trailing behind them as well, but that neck will be retracted in flight. You will find these birds, really at the water's edge in water bodies that have fish in them primarily, but they do nest colonially in trees, and these colonies of great blue herons can be quite a ways from water bodies. They will travel great distances to go to preferred feeding areas. So just because you have a great blue heron that visits your pond, on a regular basis, or your wetland, or any sort of water body near you, it doesn't mean that it's nesting, in the vicinity. It could be coming from quite a ways away. These guys are really opportunistic ambush predators. They'll do this kind of stand and wait, or they can do slow wading or slow walking, and they will pretty much eat any, animal food that they can catch. So whether that's fish, amphibians, invertebrates, reptiles, mammals, birds. I've seen a picture of them eating a least bittern, which is a heron species that we'll be covering here soon. So really, if they can catch it and it's an animal, they will try to eat it. And again, this is not a bird that is terribly vocal and that will focus on the calls too much, but they do a lot of guttural croaks and squawks. So let's just listen to an example of that here. They're kind of hollow sounding. Now there's a bit of an echo on that, but it's really like kind of a guttural croakiness. And again, it's not something that you'll hear a ton of. Maybe if you were at one of the colonies like the rookery, that you would probably be hearing this more often. But generally, as they're out on a wetland and trying to catch food, they're going to be relatively silent. So this is one where you definitely want to focus more on the visual. They do have a fairly wide distribution in North America, so you're going to likely encounter great blue herons pretty well wherever you wind up going. Another interesting species in the heron family is the American bittern. It's a relatively large heron, definitely not as very large as the great blue heron, but it's still not a small bird. It's got a relatively compact body. By comparison to the great blue heron, it's got a relatively thick neck and it's got shorter legs. Again, we're comparing it to other herons at this point. Both sexes are going to be streaky brown overall. So they're going to have, this very cryptic coloration, these long streaks down the throat. Throat and belly is going to be a little bit pale, and then they're going to have these dark streaks all down them. And the idea here is that, they're really just trying to look like their surroundings. They're trying to look like grasses. They're trying to look like dead reeds. And they'll have these dark flight feathers in flight. They have rounded wings in flight, and they also retract their neck a fair bit. So it's kind of a funny looking bird in flight. And they do have a lot of these cryptic behaviors. When they're startled in a wetland, they'll stick their necks right up and they'll point their bills towards the sky, and then they'll gently sway from side to side, kind of acting like a reed or some cattails in the wind. And actually, we'll see in a couple of photos here, they have the ability to direct their eyeballs a fair bit, and so they can be pointing that bill straight up but looking straight ahead at you, and it's a very disconcerting look to them. We'll see that in a second here. These guys are really fond of large wetlands with emergent vegetation. They'll nest in both upland habitat as well as in the marsh. And it's not a species that you typically get a lot of in an area. They seem to have, a large kind of home range need. But they have this really absolutely incredible song that, most people, if they've never heard it before, they think it's water dripping, some sort of machinery or something going. And it's just this incredible call that travels a fair distance away. You can hear these guys for at least a kilometer. So we'll play the pumperlunk call of this species. I'll play that again for you. The first few clacks are actually the bill clacking as it's gathering a bit of air in its air sacs, and it's not totally known how they make this guttural, weird liquid sounding noise. So we'll play that one again. This is a bird that you are far more likely to hear than you are to see. It took me several years of doing marsh bird surveys to actually see an American bittern, in its habitat. I had flushed a few, so I've seen a few flying, but I'd never actually seen one in the cattails, and an embarrassingly long time, probably 3 or 4 summers worth of dedicated marsh bird surveys before I ever saw one, because they're so difficult to spot. They really, hide in dense vegetation for the most part, and are very cryptic. So that sound is really something to pay attention to for this species. They're another one of these heron-like ambush predators. They'll ambush, they'll slow walk, and they'll sway from side to side to blend in with their surrounding. They'll eat insects, amphibians, small fish, small mammals, and crayfish. Again, those herons, a lot of them will just eat whatever animals that they can get their little bills on. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here that American bittern's got its bill pointed up, but its eyes are facing, towards the camera. It's pretty incredible what they do with their eyeballs. During the breeding season, as the males are displaying, they'll fluff up these white feathers that are otherwise completely hidden on the body, and they'll make their little dark patch along their throat, slightly more visible, and fluff up all of their kind of prettier looking feathers. And I just think they're really a beautiful looking species, and I just wish I could get better looks at them most of the time. But a lot of my wetland experience has been, rushing around from survey to survey, so I don't often get to sit and stalk birds in the wetland. So that's the American bittern. It's another one with a fairly broad distribution, so almost anywhere in Canada. If you're in Vancouver, you're out of luck for the American bittern, it would appear, but most places in Canada, you'll be able to see them. And the least bittern. So this is actually the species that I started my career studying. I was working for a graduate student and we were doing dedicated surveys for least bitterns along the north shore of Lake Erie around Long Point and Turkey Point. So this is a small heron-like bird. It is quite tiny. It's got quite a compact body and pretty short legs, especially for a heron. Both sexes are going to have contrasting coloration patterns. So they're going to be dark above and kind of this orangey below. It's very warm tones on most of its body. The throat is going to be white with these streaks of orange down them, and there's going to be this orange patch along the wing. So in flight, you can see that patch a lot better, but the wing is, this dark and, pale orangey colored. There is a difference between the sexes. Above, the males are going to be dark bluish black. So they're going to have that dark bit on the crown, the back, and the wing feathers are going to be this kind of, dark blue black. The females are going to have it, those same colors will be more brown and they'll have darker stripes on the breast. This is a bird that you're going to find in really large wetlands with very, very dense emergent vegetation and deep water. This is not a species that you're likely to actually lay your eyes on as well. This is one you're far more likely to hear. So here is an example of a female. She's much more chestnut colored, more brown than that kind of blue-black color. And these guys will actually peck from dense vegetation. So you can see in that bottom left-hand corner there, they're actually quite acrobatic, and they'll walk along in deep water marshes, just grabbing the cattails, grabbing all of the vegetation and moving along, kind of, grabbing along with their feet. And they'll also build feeding platforms. So they'll tip over vegetation and make a little bit of a platform so that they can stand and, catch little small fish, insects, amphibians, or small mammals as they scurry past. This is going to be a species that only gets into Manitoba just a little bit. It's fairly eastern in distribution, but there have been records of them in Saskatchewan as well. So it's worth keeping an ear out for them. And they make a cuckoo, cuckoo, coo kind of sound. And if you're familiar with the black-billed cuckoo, it sounds, a little bit similar to that, but it's going to be coming from a dense cattail wetland. So let's have a listen to that cuckoo, coo call of the least bittern. It almost sounds like a chimp even, making that little like cuckoo cooing call that they do. Let's play that one again. Okay, and in Canada and North America, their distribution is fairly eastern. There's a couple of patches in the west. And in terms of Canada, they're really, southern Quebec, southern Ontario, and just a little bit regularly into Manitoba. I don't think there's tons of them seen regularly, but it's definitely a species that you can encounter. And like I said, there has been the odd occurrence of them in Saskatchewan, so definitely worth keeping an ear out for. Okay. One other bird species that we have on the list today is the Wilson's phalarope. So these are cute little shorebirds. They have a very thin needle-like bill. So it's very, very fine. It's very, very pointed and it's straight. They have a relatively small head. And this is a species that actually reverses the typical sex roles in the mating system. So the females are going to be the more boldly colored and more aggressive of the two, and males are going to do all of the parental care. So these are females right here, and they've got the more bold coloration. They've got this kind of dark eye stripe that continues down the neck and kind of blends into the darker colors on the bird's back. Got a grayish crown and a chestnut kind of gray and, mottled back to them. They've got a salmon wash on the throat and kind of a white little chin strap patch. The males are going to look very, very similar, but they're going to be essentially a more subdued version of the female. So they're going to have a dark crown instead of the instead of the gray of the female, and that dark stripe from the eye is going to go down along the back of the neck and kind of bleed into the colors on the back of the bird, but again, more subdued fashion. You'll find these birds in wetlands with open water, and they actually float around on them. They've got an erratic flight. They kind of float like a butterfly. They just kind of bob up and down in the air a fair bit. They're kind of very, very delicate looking birds, fine proportions and even, delicate in flight. What's interesting to see for these guys is that they'll actually float out on the water and pick off, small aquatic insects, small crustaceans, little plant seeds, but they have an interesting strategy for, getting stuff up to the surface. So they'll float out, into the open water, and they'll actually spin around in circles. So they'll use their feet to spin, and the spinning action actually creates an upwelling, and that brings small little, like, insects and crustaceans closer to the surface where they can then pick them off. So it's really cute to watch them. You'll often see Phalaropes just, doing these tight little circles on the surface of a wetland. So they're very interesting little species. So if you see that, for sure you have a Phalarope. There's a few migratory species that we'll see through here in the spring and fall, but the ones that stick around to breed are these Wilson's Phalaropes. And they make this really, delicate call as well, this kind of a light woofing noise. So woof, woof, woof. Let's play that. And they can do a little bit harsher of a call as well, but that woof, 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 I find is a really distinctive call, and they'll do this as they're flying around a fair bit. This is another one that, will winter in South America and has a primarily Western Canadian distribution, but you'll see them in Southern Ontario and parts of the Maritimes as well. And we can zoom in on that Canadian context here. So reasonably widely distributed, but avoids the, the Eastern Boreal Forest, as you can see. Okay, that wraps up our bird species, and we have two toads that we're going to cover. So the two toads are going to be split into more of an Eastern and Western distribution, but they do overlap in central Manitoba. So we do have to cover both of these species, especially for our prairie context. So first up, we've got the Canadian toad. This is a medium-sized toad, and it's about, they can grow to 3 inches in length, or 7.6 centimeters. So they can be a fair bit smaller as the young ones are growing and maturing, but they will get up to this size. And for toads, some of the things that are helpful for identification are, the crests and parotoid glands on the frog's head or on the toad's head. So you can see them here, and I'll just highlight them with my mouse slowly. So these kind of, bean-shaped glands, and these glands actually produce bufotoxins, and those help them, ward off predators. They'll just make substances that taste icky to other species, so that helps in their defense mechanism. And they also have these cranial crests, and in the Canadian toad, the cranial crests run parallel and connect at the base. And as the frog or as the toad matures, eventually these will swell up and get, bigger and bigger. And some of them actually look like just one central bump with maybe a little bit of a divot in between them. But that cranial crest really is just kind of, they run parallel and connect at the base. The body color is quite variable from tan to brown to green to gray, and they have a warty appearance overall. Most frogs are definitely a lot smoother looking on their skin surface, and their skin surface is moister than the toads. So the toads are definitely more of a terrestrial species, but these guys also do congregate around wetlands because they require them for breeding. So, they're often found in the vicinity of them. So they have a warty appearance, and that those warts are surrounded by dark spots. You'll find them around ponds, lakes, and potholes. And for whatever reason, my sound is missing from this one, but they have a long monotone trill. I'm sure it's in the other, oh no. Anyway, we'll see it in a second, I'm sure. So it's a long monotone trill, and it's longer than the tree frogs. They have a very central distribution. So, in Canada, we've got Winnipeg, we've got Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and they just get into the Northwest Territories. So we'll play that call in a second here because I do have it elsewhere. The American toad is a very similar looking species, except when we're looking at those cranial crests, they form a V behind the eyes. So you can see it here in this example up in the top left-hand corner, kind of a V of that crest behind the frog's or the toad's eye. I keep saying frog. All toads are frogs. they're quite similar. So what's important to consider here is that if you are on the shore of Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, you might also have Fowler's toads, which are going to look a little bit different and sound different to this species, but they're going to be fairly similar. But in most of Eastern Canada, the American toad is going to be the only toad that you have. Its body color is variable. They can be brown, even reddish, especially as you get farther north, or olive colored. And they're also quite warty. They do have fewer warts per spots than the Canadian toad, and it's often usually just 1 or 2 warts per spot on this variety of species. Compared to me. You'll find these guys in a wide variety of terrestrial habitats, and they have a very long monotone trill, and this one can be up to 30 seconds in length. So let's play that one. You can hear the boreal chorus frogs going in the background. So the Canadian toad is going to sound very, very similar to that, but it's going to be a little bit shorter in duration on average. So that is our American toad. So let's compare our duck sounds for the day. So we've got the Gadwall and the American Wigeon. The Gadwall is what sounds like those Sesame Street aliens going bep, 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 bep. And the American Wigeon, focus a little bit less on the sound for this one, but just once again. Zoo, 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 zoo kind of sounds for our American Wigeon. Great blue heron, gonna do some guttural croaks and squawks. And the Wilson's Phalarope doing that light woof, woof, woof. Oops. The American Bittern is definitely one that you want to learn by sound because you will more often hear them than see them. It's such an incredible sounding bird, and like I said, that travels quite a long distance, so you can be a fair ways away and still be hearing American bitterns off in the distance. And that least bittern that you can keep an ear out for, that coo, 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 coo. Again, that sound coming from, deep inside a dense wetland. That sound doesn't travel nearly as far as compared to the American bittern. I don't know why my Canadian toad sound disappeared. I swear it was there earlier. That's very strange. Oops. Okay. So Canadian toad is going to have a long monotone trill. It's going to be longer than the tree frogs, but shorter than the American toad. And we'll have our American toad example here. Very long trill. And they are quite loud. That's our American toad. And that wraps up our species for this evening. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you want to reach out, you can contact me at skatlas@birdscanada.org. You can visit the website, birdscanada.org/birdscience/MarshWatch. Ooh, it's hard tonight. MarshWatch, and you can find information, about past recordings. You can find all of the quizzes on there, and as well as more details for our upcoming events that will all be posted there. You can contact Birds Canada on all of the socials, and I'd just like to say a big thank you to our supporters of this project, the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, as well as the Government of Canada.